So this is episode number 98, and we're going to be talking about connecting a variety of different types of handheld radios to your Winlink station in order to use an HT to send Winlink traffic. So when you're doing this, you're pretty much always going to be operating with VARA or with packet, and it's always going to be VHF or UHF, and it's always going to be using the FM modulation mode. For all of your handhelds, that's pretty much what you're going to be operating with. So with the packet side, we'll start there. All packet radio requires a terminal node controller of some kind. Now, these are broken into two different categories, either external or internal. If we look at the external TNCs or terminal node controllers, there really is, there's a variety of them out there on the market, but the most common ones are the ones by Cantronics or the Pactor modems. Now, when you start thinking about using one of these with a handheld, I've got a couple of examples right here. So this is the Pactor, or this is the Cantronics. This is the packet communicator. It's the 9612, and this is the Pactor modem. Now, you'll notice as soon as you look at this, these are much larger than your typical handheld radio, right? Physically, they're much larger. They're also almost as expensive, if not as expensive or more so than pretty much every handheld that's out there on the market. I mean, you're going to pay a few $100s for a packet TNC, or you're going to pay starting at $1,000 plus for a Pactor modem. So more than likely, this is not going to be the way you're going to go when it comes to working with a handheld radio. So we can pretty much kind of like take those off the plate at this point as something that you're going to be operating with. There are a few radios out on the market that do have internal TNCs, a few HTs that are on the market that have this capability here. Now, on all of these, what you're looking for when you're looking at the specs is you're looking for something that says in the specs that it has a built-in TNC or terminal node controller. There are a few of them out there. There are not many. These are usually your higher end HTs that have this. Now, some of them will say they've got built-in APRS. Now, that is not a guarantee that it's got a built-in TNC, but it's a pretty good bet. You might be able to get a radio that says it's got built-in APRS to be able to work with this. Not every single one is going to do this. Another thing that you're going to be looking for in the specs is you're going to be looking for the KISS term, KISS, keep it simple, stupid. It may also say KISS 12. For instance, on the Kenwood D74 and D75, these have built-in TNCs in them. And when you turn them on and you get them set up to be able to do packet radio, you'll press a couple of buttons and you'll bring up the TNC here on screen. I'll walk through that process here in just a little while so everybody's able to see that. For the most part, though, when you're talking about working Winlink with a handheld, more than likely you're going to be doing VARA FM, and this requires having a sound card connected between the radio and your computer. Now, there are a handful of your handheld radios that have an internal sound card, but again, these are your very high-end radios. Think the ICOM ID52. Think the ICOM 705. Those will have an internal sound card, and you'll be able to do this just between the radio and your computer. However, pretty much across the board, what you're looking for are these that are going to have an SDR. They're almost all going to be an SDR handheld. So it's a pretty rare thing to have in a handheld. Pretty much everything else is going to require an external sound card. And these fall into a couple of categories. There is the DigiRig. The other common external sound card is going to be the USB signal link. Now, both of these are relatively low cost. For instance, the DigiRig, here I'll switch over to the overhead here. This is the size of a DigiRig. They're pretty small little external devices. And this is the actual size of a signal link, USB. Now, when you connect these, you're connecting them to your computer via a USB cable. And then on the other side of them, you're using some specialized cables to connect over to your radio, whatever that radio happens to be. The signal links typically are right around $100 to a little bit more. The DigiRigs typically run in the $50 to kind of $75 range. So these are definitely the lower cost model option. They're really nice. They're super small. They work with a variety of different radios and radio types. The signal links also, when you open them up, David will talk a little bit more about this. There's jumpers inside so that you can set the signal link to work with each different specific radio, but you are going to need custom cabling to go to make everything work for this. So when it comes to your external sound cards, this is an option that will work with every single handheld on the market that will do analog FM. Basically, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be connecting through the handheld speaker mic port. So if your handheld is capable of having an external speaker mic or an external headset, then you can use an external sound card and do VARA FM with that particular radio. When it comes to how you connect the radio to your computer, you have a couple of different I/O options. The first of all is Bluetooth, and we'll see some examples of this. These are pretty much only on your most premium radios on the higher end brands. So when you're talking ICOM, you're talking Kenwood, and you're talking Yaesu, it's usually their flagship model that they've included a Bluetooth connection between the radio and your computer. This works extremely well once you get it all set up, and I will demo that with a Kenwood D74 connecting via Bluetooth to my laptop, and we'll use that to send some traffic here in a few minutes. But this is a little bit harder to find. The nice part about this is there are no cables. You have your computer, you have your radio, you turn them both on, you make sure the settings are correct, and you send your Winlink traffic. It is super easy. Matter of fact, yesterday, once I got my Kenwood back up and running again, I walked over to the grocery store, did some shopping. On the way back, I stopped at a local park. I pulled my Kenwood D74 out, set it on the park bench. I pulled my laptop out, I connected the two, and in less than a minute, I was able to send Winlink traffic. I mean, it is super easy to be able to do this once it's set up. It really is a premium type of feature, and you only see this on the top end radios. The next is USB. Now, this is typically a feature that's in the more upper class radios. So all the different manufacturers will have some sort of radio that has a USB port on it that is capable of doing either VARA or packet. However, there's a little asterisk there on the USB port because not all USB ports are created equal. Some USB ports, for instance, where's my radio? Where is it? It's in here somewhere. For instance, the Yaesu FT70D, here it is. The FT70D is a good example of this. So I love this little HT. I love the rugged ability of it. It is really great in hand. It's got really good audio in and out on it. And you can see that there's a data port here on the side. And if I pull the little flap up, I know it's a little hard to see with the lighting there, there's a USB mini port in there to be able to connect. However, this is just for programming the radio. It doesn't push audio in and out of that port. So you can't just directly connect every single radio that has a USB port on it and do all of this Winlink traffic. Some USB ports on some radios are just for charging. Other USB ports are just for programming the radios. You got to make sure that it has the capability to be able to transmit audio in and out of the radio. And that is actually controlled usually inside of the settings that you've got inside of the radio. So you can't just look at the radio and go, oh, this one's going to work in this, that, or the other. You really got to read all of the specs that are there to figure out if it's going to work for you to be able to do the Winlink traffic. The next one is a serial port. Now, someone out there may know of a serial port on a handheld radio. I don't know of any. So if you know of one, go ahead and let us know in the comments what that particular radio is. But most of them, when we get into the mobile radios, and we'll talk about those next week. But when you're talking about handheld radios, most do not have a serial port built onto the HT. So this is pretty much one that's just not, you're not going to find a connection for. Everything else has that audio in-out port, and that's pretty much the most common that's out there that you're going to be doing. So 90% of your radios out there, you're going to be going through the microphone and the speaker port with the push to talk in order to make all this work. Okay, if you've been a fan of this show for a while, then you likely have seen this particular diagram before. So here's your radio that you've got, and you're going to be connecting it to your computer to Winlink in order to make all of this stuff work. So this is general, regardless of if you're using an HT or using a mobile or using a base station. You need to make a connection between your radio and the computer. And this can be either a physical or a virtual interface, depending on the specifics of the radio that you're using and how it's going to connect to your computer. What's common is you have two lines of communication that you always have to deal with. Out of your radio, you have the receive line and you have the transmit line. And when you're starting to talk about these, when you look at the receive audio, you're always talking about the speaker port out of the audio coming out of your radio has to go into the computer, and that's going to go into your computer's microphone port, or whatever the interface is, microphone port. Then you're going to come out of your computer's speaker port in order to generate audio out of the computer, and that's going to go into the radio's microphone port. If you're going to remember one diagram, remember this particular diagram, because this is where most people get tripped up when they start thinking about where is the audio going and where is it coming from in order to go in and out of your radio. So once you kind of get that locked in, where you're going into your computer is the sound card. Now, many of you are going to say, hey, Chris, I've got a built-in sound card in my laptop, in my computer. Isn't that going to be just fine? Well, if you're into pain and suffering, you can try and make this work. However, when you're trying to do WinLink, like if you're just doing it as a test, yeah, you can get this to work. However, when you're actually out in the field and you're trying to send WinLink traffic, you don't want to have to reconfigure all the audio within your system. Sound cards built into the computers are also not optimized for talking directly to your radio. There's also, it's missing the control circuit that's in there as well, and which is your push to talk. And you're going to say, hey, Chris, but my radio, it's got that Vox feature. Yeah, again, if you're into pain and suffering, you can try and get this to set up to work with Vox so that when your computer makes audio out of its speaker, it automatically keys your radio in order to transmit it. The problem is getting everything to balance properly and getting good transmission of audio to come out reliably out of your system. That ends up being a real challenge when you're trying to use this method. So a better option is to use some sort of USB connection that goes between the radio and the computer. Now, when you start talking about mobile radios, they will oftentimes have a data port, but more than likely, you're not going to have a data port directly on your handheld radio. You're going to need to go through an external USB sound card. Again, this is either that SignalLink or the DigiRig, and there are a few others that are out there on the market, but these are the most common ones that amateur radio operators are going to be getting. So your sound card interface is going to sit in between your radio and your computer. And these two blue wires, the two blue lines right here, those are the unique cables that you're going to need to go between your radio and your sound device, whatever it happens to be, your sound card, and then between your sound card and your computer. And that is another one of the gotchas that you've got to be able to deal with, making sure that you have the exact right cables that work between your radio, your interface, and then between your interface and the computer. Huge mix up a lot of times. Not all cables, just because the cable looks the same, it doesn't mean that all of the pins inside are all wired. It doesn't mean that all of the right resistors are inside of those wires in order to make all of the different keying and transmission levels to work properly between the devices. So it is a little bit more complicated than just grabbing any old cable off the shelf. You're going to go into your computer's USB port at this point. Now, this is the place where 99.99% of the problems exist when you're trying to get Winlink working between a handheld and your computer, or really any radio and your computer, because all of the audio running through your Windows PC is going to all run into the Windows sound control panel. And you need to have the correct drivers or USB audio codec in order to work with your particular sound device that you're working with. You also need to have all of the levels set correctly and a bunch of other settings that are in there that are going to be specific to the interface that you've chosen. You need to make sure that all of this stuff works exactly right in order to get your audio to transfer onto the next step. And anytime you run a Windows update, which, as we all know, happens on a very regular basis, the likelihood that something is going to get screwed up here inside of your Windows sound control panel is extremely high. I spent hours and hours yesterday working through various different problems, trying to get all of these demos to work again, specifically because a Windows update came up and it completely messed up all of my connections for VARA. And so literally nothing worked. And it took me all day of going through. I ended up calling David, W0DHG. We spent hours on a Zoom call together, like tracing through exactly where the update was. And oftentimes, if you run a Windows update, you got to let that update completely run and then run it again, because you'll oftentimes find that there's been a second patch that fixes something that broke in the first patch. And you got to make sure that all of those are run again, and then go back through all of your audio settings, because a lot of these will get messed up. And I'll show you where those show up here in just a few minutes. Once you come out of your Windows sound control panel, that's when you're going into either your VARA FM, or if you're using packets, you're usually going into UZ7HO sound modem at that point. UZ7HO sound modem is an excellent utility specifically for troubleshooting, and David will talk a little bit more about that later on in the show. Once you come out of whatever this interface is for whichever mode you're going to be using, that's when you're going to be connecting directly to Winlink. So this is your full signal chain, and more than likely, your problem is either a physical connection over here between your radio, your interface, and the computer. It's usually somewhere in here that you've got a wrong pin, a cable is not fully seated. Those are some of the most common problems that you've got. Then the vast majority of the problems are right here in the Windows sound control panel. And then after that, it's just a few settings that are inside of either your VARA or your sound modem. So once you deal with all of those problems, now we're going to talk about some radio-specific settings that you need to make sure that you're setting on your handheld in order to get your handheld to work properly with Winlink. And the first one is that you have to manually set the frequency that you're going to be operating on to try and connect to either the other station or into an RMS gateway. On handhelds, when you're dealing with VARA FM and you're dealing with packet, there isn't cat control that's set up within Winlink to automatically control the frequency for your particular radio, because most of these radios don't have cat control built into them. So it's not a feature that's really built in. So you manually dial in the frequency into your radio to make sure that you're on the right frequency. The next thing is, and this is the place where I see most people screw up also, you have to set your squelch to 0. Now, let's think about what the squelch is doing. The squelch is a feature inside of your radio, so you don't have to hear all of the static, the baseline static that is going on your radio. So your radio is nice and quiet. However, the signals that we're sending are all those little tiny digital blips and blops that are going back and forth between your radio and the other radio. And if you have your squelch set up at any level, you're going to be cutting some of that traffic out. So you always want to turn your squelch all the way down to 0, and then you'll be able to transmit your data via VARA or via packet much more effectively. Now, Does this work if you have your squelch turned up to say 1, so you don't have any audio coming out? It does work, but you're going to reduce your signals. You're going to reduce the transmission and the effectiveness of your signal. So as soon as you take your external, your cable, and you plug it into the radio, especially on most handhelds, you're going into that microphone speaker mic port. You're not going to hear the audio coming out of your radio anyway, so don't worry about it. Turn that squelch to 0 so you get all of the audio signals that you want to have going through to do your communication, and life will be much better for you. The next is make sure that your radio is set to the correct side. Many handheld radios will have an A receiver and a B receiver, so you can listen to 2 different frequencies at the same time. Most of your handheld radios will only do data transmission, or they'll only primarily work doing this kind of transmission on either the A side or the B side. It's going to be unique for your particular radio. So make sure you're going to have to get out the manual and figure out which is the right one for your particular radio. Audio has to be routed to the proper port. So for instance, on the Kenwood D74, when I go to do that with Bluetooth, I have to make sure that all of the audio coming out of the radio is being routed into the Bluetooth port, or all of the audio is being routed, my TNC is being routed into my USB port. Likewise, you have to make sure it's routed into the microphone or speaker port. That varies by settings that are inside of your radio that you have to go in and figure out where those are located. And not all radios are going to do this. You're going to just have to go through your particular setup and figure that out. Next is make sure that your audio levels are set correctly. I'll show you how to do this on the Baofeng. For instance, for many of these radios, when you've got your VARA FM screen up, you'll have a little VU meter, and you want to adjust the volume on your radio speaker to make sure that you get the level set to the correct level. And I'll show you exactly what that looks like here in just a few minutes. If you're doing packet using an internal TNC, you need to make sure you turn that TNC on within the radio. Again, I'll show you what that looks like. And then there might be other radio specific settings that are unique to your radio that are not going to be something that is in this generalized list. So it is going to take some testing on your part to be able to figure out what those settings are in order to make it work. And that brings us to this. You got to practice. You got to practice and practice and practice with your setup. Make sure that you're practicing with your radio and your particular computer, and take detailed notes all along the way. Once you get this up and running, you want to go back and you want to take screenshots of all your different settings. You want to know what all of your settings are on your radio, what things that you set. Try and make sure that you're able to take another set of make those settings so that you can delete everything and you can turn them back on, so that you know exactly what those settings are.
Explain something.